Please welcome Jean Kirkpatrick, Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and Director of Geopolitics of Energy Project at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Megan O'Sullivan.
A short while ago, I was invited to a dinner to discuss the future of energy. It was an intimate affair, maybe a dozen or so people, from interesting backgrounds in government and in business. And at one point in the evening, our host said, "Let's go around the table and have everyone say a few words about how they see the future of energy. And when you do that, could you please say what you think the relative role of politics and policy are, and what technology and markets have to do with the future? And by the way, when you do this, please assign a percentage to each of these factors." Now, what ensued shouldn't have been surprising. Those with a business background attributed as much as 95% of the future of energy to technology and markets. And those with a government background thought that politics and policy deserved an equally heavy weight. Now, this was interesting to me because it confirmed what I had long ago thought, and that is there is a world of people who view the world primarily through a lens of policy and foreign policy. And there is another world of people who view the world primarily through the lens of energy markets. And there's a relatively small number of people who inhabit both circles. Now, why is this? I've often asked myself. And here's the explanation I've come up with. If you are someone rooted in markets, words like Sunni and Shia may be outside your comfort zone. And if you're rooted in the world of foreign policy, words like contango and backwardation are definitely foreign words to you, but maybe not of the variety you care to understand. And the consequence of this is what Bob Jervis, who's an American political psychologist, describes, is that the human brain can only hold so many factors in it when trying to understand why a certain phenomenon happens. And so it is natural for the human mind to simply attribute greater weight to the issues that it understands and to dismiss the issues that it doesn't. So as a result, we have a very small group of people who look at the world and try to interpret events both through the lens of foreign policy and the lens of energy markets. Now, we're very lucky because today and at this conference, we have a lot of the people who actually inhabit this red area here in this room. And that is critical for doing what is one of the major themes of this conference, and that is interpreting and understanding the energy transformation. The energy transformation is one of the most exciting and dynamic things happening in the world today, and that is the shift from a global energy mix of today to something quite different in the future. Now, simply because I say this is one of the most exciting things going on doesn't mean it's the first time the world has seen such an energy transition. It used to be that the world was powered primarily by wood. And then in the mid-1800s, this shifted to coal. And later, in the early 1900s, the dominant fuel became oil. So perhaps if we look at these energy transitions, we'll have some insight into the energy transformation that we're seeking to understand today. Let me just raise a few very high-level ways in which these past energy transitions may influence how we understand our own. First, we know from these past energy transitions that it can take generations for an energy transition to complete itself. Coal took more than 60 years to go from constituting 5% of the world's global energy mix to constituting more than 50%. Secondly, we know that the individual experiences of countries differ dramatically in a global energy transformation. In 1900, many European countries were already fully powered by coal. But it was as late as the 1950s that China still got a majority of its energy from biomass and wood. And even today, there are many African countries that still rely on biomass and wood for much of their energy. Thirdly, we know that energy transitions occur not because an individual energy resource is expended. The IEA tells us that if the world so chose, it would have another 143 years of consuming coal at the current rate it does today. And if we look not just at proven reserves, but look at total resources of coal, this number goes to close to 3,000 years. Fourthly, we know from past energy transitions that the geopolitical domain has a big impact on how they unfold. We can just look at the transformation of Western Europe from coal to oil and note the importance of the Trans-Arabian pipeline in that transformation, which brought large quantities of oil from Saudi Arabia to Lebanon to Europe. And this pipeline was viable and was made possible by American support that depended on the perception and the reality that this pipeline was key to the success of the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe. And lastly, looking at these past energy transitions tells us that energy transitions have huge consequences themselves for geopolitics. So again, this transition from wood to coal brought with it the possibility of making iron, and brought with that the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, as we know, transformed American and European societies from one of agrarian and rural societies to economic, industrial, and urban societies. And we're all very familiar with the geopolitical consequences of the shift from coal to oil, which had a huge role in increasing the strategic importance of the world we're living in today. So, looking at those past energy transitions, what does it tell us about today? It tells us that there'll be big geopolitical consequences. And what if we just look at what has happened in energy markets over the last 10 years? What if we just focus on the unconventional boom, the ability to extract greater oil and gas than we have ever before? We can see that just that development in the last 10 years has had huge geopolitical consequences. And I'll just name a few that have already been started to be discussed within this conference. First, as we well know, this boom in unconventional oil and gas has helped propel many countries to adopt ambitious and unprecedented reform programs to transform economies and even societies to be less dependent on oil and gas. And in the United States, the boom in unconventional oil and gas has boosted American hard and soft power, but it has done so through markets more than policy. And this distinction is very important because it has meant that American influence has continued to expand even while Washington may be adopting policies that seem to be more policies of retrenchment. And if we look at Russia, we can see that this boom in unconventional oil and gas has made it more difficult for Russia to use natural gas as a political tool and has somewhat frustrated Russia's efforts to permeate Asian markets. And finally, looking at China, this boom in unconventional oil and gas has somewhat loosened constraints on Chinese foreign policy, which used to be focused almost exclusively on getting enough energy imports, particularly of oil. This has lubricated China's rise in the international system and has allowed China to adopt some non-energy foreign policy objectives. So if that has been the impact of simply the boom in unconventional oil and gas, we can only imagine the impact of a much greater, a much more comprehensive energy transformation of the kind that we're talking about today. Now, as Fred mentioned, there are still many, many uncertainties about this energy transformation, but we do know that it is going to be very deeply interwoven with geopolitics. Let's think about, for instance, the reality that the international system that exists under which this energy transformation occurs will really influence the shape of that transition. So just for the sake of making this point, let's think of three potential world orders under which this energy transformation could occur or could continue, and what the impact would be. First, we might have a global order that resembles much of the order that the world has seen for the last 70 years, since the end of World War I, and that is the liberal international economic order persists. America decides it is committed to defending this order. Under this kind of international order, we might see an energy transition that is a market-based transition. And in this transition, we see that open markets, innovation, technology, consumer preferences, digitization, a distributed energy system, that all of these things are dominant in forcing the energy transition. And in this kind of transition, we'll definitely see greater energy efficiency, we'll see greater deployment of renewables, but we'll continue to see a significant role for oil and gas, and maybe even coal, given their cost competitiveness in an open market. Alternatively, what if the world gets its act together? And actually we experience an unprecedented level of cooperation and coordination. Well, this will increase our chances of having a top-down energy transition. And this kind of transition may be driven by governments that adopt policies and mandates and work with other governments to pursue targets that are predetermined. And in this kind of energy transformation, we probably see the greatest role for renewables, but also see a pretty significant place for other alternative energies like nuclear power and hydro. And then finally, we have to consider the possibility that the world doesn't actually fall into one of these kinds of transitions, and that the global order continues to be fragmented and maybe moves more in the direction of multipolarity, and there's less international cooperation. In this system, maybe we don't actually have the energy transformation that we're anticipating. And perhaps we have what could be called a thwarted transition, where the energy mix continues to be overwhelmingly dominated by fossil fuels. So again, the type of world order that exists, that is either sustained or evolves, really matters how this transformation in energy takes place. But then we also have to look at the flip side of the coin. What energy transformation is realized will fundamentally affect geopolitics. So if we just take a look at these three scenarios that I painted for you, we can see that. So first, returning to the market-driven transition. This might be the transition that is best for the Middle East in terms of its political power. So here you have maybe a diminished role for oil, but still a significant role. And the low price of oil might knock out high-cost producers, meaning that low-cost producers in the Middle East are the sources of the majority or the overwhelming majority of the oil that the world consumes. And with that will come significant political power. Alternatively, in this market transition, or actually in addition in this market transition, we may see less of a role for central governments where distributed energy systems are more important. And we'll see the rise of non-state actors, of corporations, and of individuals. And in this world, there's greater electrification, no doubt about that. And with that comes the ability to bring energy to greater populations and alleviate energy poverty and open doors for more economic prosperity. But with this electrification, we know comes additional risks and vulnerabilities, particularly in the cyber domain, but also could open the door to more asymmetric warfare. But if we shift gears and we look at, again, a different transition, the top-down transition, we return to the government-driven transition. Well, in terms of geopolitics, this is the one that probably bears the highest likelihood that the world meets its climate goals. And that would be a significant geopolitical contribution if the world were able to avoid, or at least not face in the same severity, the kinds of geopolitical problems that will come from climate change. In this scenario, this may be the best scenario for China. If countries are trying to move to predetermined goals, they'll need capital, finance, technology, and perhaps China will be best positioned to offer these, and with them will come enormous political influence. We could see the reordering of very significant geopolitical relationships, the Chinese and Indian relationship being one among them. In addition, under this scenario, there'll be less of a role for energy trade and more of a focus on domestic energy production. This will mean that geography matters more than ever, partially because the global market might matter less, but with an increase in reliance on electrification, electricity trade, and supergrids, who your neighbors are will matter more than ever. And finally, the resource curse may shift from being associated with energy outputs to being more associated with energy inputs. And what I mean by that is some of the developmental challenges that have often gone with oil and gas may now be associated more with things like lithium and cobalt. And finally, if we look at the third type of transition, the thwarted transition or the non-transition, this may be a geopolitical world that is fraught with all kinds of geopolitics of climate change. And we'll spend some time talking about them these next few days, I'm sure. But they will include many things like conflict, increasing cooperation, and refugee flows that could pose existential threats for certain regions of the world like Europe. Now, there are many important and interesting conversations happening here and other parts of the world about how to make this energy transition a reality, how to move and transform the global energy mix. But there are relatively few conversations about what the geopolitical consequences of success or failure in this domain is. And I commend the Atlantic Council and its partners here in the UAE for making this a focus of the conference, because it may be that some of the geopolitical consequences of a shift are either so desirable or so dire that they should influence how we think about and how we go about the actual energy transformation. Either way, I'm very grateful to be here, pleased to meet you all, and look forward to the insights that a group that inhabits this middle area, that wears both a political lens and a market lens, will bring to this very pressing question. Thank you.